given to Abraham by the word of the Lord directly. So even though an intermediary may be important, he is only a third party acting between two other parties. Moses was the human link between God and the people, but he lacked any independent authority. Furthermore, the law given at Sinai through Moses, the intermediary, placed binding obligations on two parties. Who were those two parties? God and man. So the Mosaic covenant had both an intermediary and it was conditional upon the obedience of both parties. However, Paul argues God is one. When he made his promise to Abraham and through him to all believers, whether Jew or Gentile, he made the promise on his own account, directly and personally. So you see, the Mosaic covenant requires human obedience. And therein lies its weakness, right? We can't obey it. But the covenant of promise is God's gracious gift, requiring nothing of man but acceptance. This distinction is also stated clearly in Romans chapter 8. What the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his Son. And so we see that Moses was great, and God used Moses in a great and marvelous way to deliver something to us that was important and good and right and holy and righteous. But God is far greater, and his promise to his people that by faith as we look to Christ, we will live, he delivered directly himself with no intermediary in between. And so we see finally in verses 21 and 22 that we cannot obtain righteousness by obedience to the law. Paul continues to show this through the book of Galatians over and over and over. He continues to press this point. So he writes in verse 21, "Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law. But the Scripture imprisoned everything under sin, so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe." Now, here specifically, Paul is re-emphasizing this main point because he wants to make clear that the Judaizers are correct in their assumption that there really would be a problem in reconciling the Abrahamic covenant with the Mosaic covenant if it were really possible to gain everlasting life by works of the law. But there's no question that Paul has been emphatic throughout his letter that the law does not impart life because we are all law breakers. Therefore, no man can find a right standing with God based upon their own works of the law. And so Paul sort of concedes one of the Judaizers' main points. He's sort of saying, sure, you're right. If the law was given so that you could obtain life through the law, then righteousness would come by the law, and you would be right in insisting that the Galatians adhere to the legal requirements that you're seeking to press them into. But Paul, have shown you that there's no possible way for you to obtain life through the law. Therefore, the legal requirements that you're seeking to bind the Galatians to are not for righteousness' sake. Law cannot save because law cannot give a new heart. And you need a new heart. No one can keep the law of God perfectly, which is God's standard. To be righteous before his eyes, you must be perfect. And so Paul sort of harkens back to his previous hypothetical. If you could keep the law, you could be saved by the law. He's made several of those statements. But he identifies that in practice, the law only condemns the sons and daughters of Adam. So Paul writes in Romans 7, "The commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death." In other words, God gave Adam and Eve the law to live by in the covenant of works, and their keeping of the covenant of works guaranteed life, but they broke the covenant of works. And so the law now only brings death instead. That is what Paul means when he writes in verse 22, "The Scripture imprisoned everything under sin."